next session in the Dark Archives conference, which is on the Future Archive. Can we start by thanking the people who've organized this conference? It has been, I cannot even imagine what's gone on behind the screens. Can we have a little virtual round of applause for Stephen and all the people involved? I know that sitting here, I've had a lot of help from grad students and people behind the scenes who are keeping everything running, and thank you to everybody. Just a shame they couldn't give us all kind of coffee and cake, but never mind. So this session, building on everything that's gone before, is intended to look at the future archive. So what I'm looking for from the panelists is some speculation, some thinking about where we go next. There's no right or wrong answers, but the papers that we've heard, I hope you've all seen the papers, the presentations cover a huge range of questions and really have set us up nicely for this. It's billed as a debate. There may be some provocation, there may be some controversy. Let's see how we go. One of the things I think that's really nice about this session is we have some scholars, some archivists, some librarians, and some hybrid people who wear multiple hats. So I think we have a nice range of perspectives on this question of the future archive. And that's something I'm interested in teasing out. I'm the keeper of rare books and early manuscripts at Cambridge University Library. So my background is as a librarian. So I come at the future archive from that perspective, from someone who has looked after archives, rather than use them as a scholar. My scholarly works on manuscripts. So I'm interested in teasing out some of those nuances around the different stakeholders, the different users of archives, and how we might kind of negotiate the needs of different users of the archive. I guess, first of all, we should start by what do we mean by the future archive? I don't know if any of our panelists want to kick off with that. How would they term or see that the future archive? If I could ask panelists just to raise their hands, and I physically or digitally, and I'll bring them in.
Okay, no reason to continue sitting in silence. I'll jump in. This is Michelle Warren. And before I say something about the future, I want to start by recognizing that yesterday and today in the United States and Canada, there's a scholar strike going on for racial justice. And there's a lot of great online activity and videos. If you're on my timeline, you can see some of the hashtags. I'd really encourage people to take a look at that wherever you are in the world. There's been a kind of geopolitical thread through a lot of the talks and conversations that I've heard, everything from Latvian nationalism to regional funding in Spain, infrastructures. There's a lot of different pieces, and I really want to call out to that dimension of the future, because for me, thinking about the future really entails a deeper engagement with the past, not the medieval past, but the past that has preserved the archives and the repositories and the libraries that we now access in various complicated ways. And there are a lot of different things I could say about that, but what I'm going to do is just pop into the chat a land acknowledgement that I developed for the Remix the Manuscript project that I mentioned in my talk the work that we've been doing on the digital brute Middle English chronicle that was purchased at Dartmouth in 2006 and digitized in 2009. And this is a practice that is becoming more common in the US and Canada, to really think about the ways that our work, our buildings, where we, you know, our existence really in a settler colonial state is a ground for the work we do and for the possible future work we can do. So as I've been thinking about the future and kind of the ethics of all that's entailed in digital and in preservation, I've been trying to engage in a way with these legacies and weave it into the scholarly questions that I'm asking, and to do so in a way that makes it more embarrassing and awkward to not talk about it than it is to talk about it. So.
Does anyone else want to pick up on this, want to come in on this? Elaine?
Yeah, I want to second everything Michelle has said, and particularly in relation to the scholars' strike. This conference was arranged before those dates, and so that's unfortunate in some respects, but it does give us the opportunity to talk about what Michelle is talking about, the geopolitical significances of the papers that we've seen, the voices that have been articulated that one very often doesn't get to hear at all, from Eastern Europe, from Israel, and there's a lot of representation that is not being represented here, and that's one of the things about the Future Archive. I think I mentioned it very briefly in my talk. Is this the idea of first of all representation? So who is represented and who is not? And in fact, Suze, I think you're kind of prompting us to think in those ways too. And that's not just in the medieval sense, but again, as Michelle is saying, in the more recent past, and actually not just in colonized countries like America or Australia, New Zealand, but also the African continent, even parts of Europe that themselves were colonized. And I think of Welsh manuscripts that are so desperately underrepresented in work that scholars are doing, that are often mislabeled. Georgia Henley is working on this. Manuscripts that almost certainly were written in Wales that are not shown as such, that are appropriated by other centres by scholars, or given over to other centres by scholars, and so on. But representation very broadly, and partly because I think as we all know as scholars, that the archive or the library, the repository, the work that they do, the things that are chosen, the work is never neutral. So the site of these materials is never a neutral site. I am a textual editor, or at least by training, I suppose. I'm a textual editor, manuscript scholar from that point of view. And I just want to kind of say that from a catalogue to images, to the digitizing of images, to the way that the digital repository is put together, to the way that archives represent themselves, every single step of this is a choice. And those choices represent mediation, and mediation is editing. So in fact, one could argue that every single step of the work that we do, every one of us here who represents our various fields, disciplines, employers, areas of research, we are all mediators or editors. And then it comes back to the question of representation and who is represented in the archive, not just in the way that we privilege particular materials, but also who we think we are representing. And I think it was Sophie Clayton who was talking about scribes preempting their participatory readers, and we are. And I really, I'm interested to hear what Ben says, and you, Suze, in relation to and Michelle, to the Parker on the web project. Who are these anticipated users? Suze, you've raised this in the questions that you asked us to think about. I want to point out too, because I have made some notes in between getting Suze's email and now. We are representative of a much broader spectrum scholarship and of professional activities and persons. But we don't know who the users of these digitized digital materials are. We don't know who they are. And what we are, it is incumbent on us to do is to make our material, to mediate our material responsibly and for accessibility, because we are not most people. We are not the majority of people who might come to this stuff. And so editing, mediation, those two sides of the same idea, is one thing I really want to highlight in relation to the future archive. Representation is another, and I think it can all be subsumed, for me, under a phrase, the legible archive. So to make this archive legible, and the archive in the sense of all of the materials that are in our keep, all of them, that includes the catalogue as part of the archive, right? The framework, the interpretative framework, which I bang on about a lot, but the interpretative framework that we put around our images is about making the archive legible. It's not about the objects at all. It's about the frameworks and the mediation that we provide. I've been very lonely. I've missed people. Sorry, I talk so much.
No, thank you. That is enormously rich, and that's covered a huge number of themes that I want to tease out. Let's start off with this idea of mediation and editing, and the idea that the decisions we make as scholars or cataloguers or people who bring collections of material together, the impact of that. Does anybody want to come in on, reflect on that process within their own work? I'm thinking, Francisca and Pavlina, the work that you are doing with the translation of material, that idea of, if you remove something from one context and put it in a different context, you're creating meaning. Do you want to say anything about that?
Right, I was a little bit distracted because what I've been thinking about mediation is maybe taken a slightly different direction, but this just been a major problem or a major issue in our project for years, that although while we have a huge amount of technical work and a huge amount of research and cataloging and collecting manuscripts, we somehow it's also important to keep in mind that we are also creating a new genre almost, and we are creating new texts, and that we should put a lot of effort into making people interested in it, like showing this text to students and organizing workshops and maybe developing some research lines and asking questions. So yeah, so much about meditation I've been thinking about.
And that's a responsibility almost to the material to present it or make it available to people in a way that makes it legible, that makes it accessible. Yeah, I was this idea of responsibility, I was very struck by your assertion that you are creating an archive in the database, in the project that you're doing. You know, that's one definition of an archive, is the scholarly material that you create. I don't know if anybody else thinks of their work as an archive and how they relate to that.
Yeah, Suzanne, if I can add, if that's fine. So one piece I might add is like many of you, I work with ecclesiastical collections in Spanish cathedrals, everywhere from northern Spain, Burgos, all the way towards the south, towards Granada. And one of the things that kind of really plays out that I'm sure that you see similarly is kind of the dynamics of the Catholic Church and the proclivities of its need to kind of protect itself while you're researching sensitive topics. So as we can all appreciate, Spain is this place that from 711 to 1492 that has a mixture of cultures, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And it presents really kind of a complicated world. And often the only place where we can really study these topics, if I want to study Jews in relationship to Christians, the only place to go to is the cathedral to really look at the kind of transactional economic documents that show property leases, vineyards, every imaginable kind of economic activity. So two things can happen. This is the point I kind of want to see how other people respond to this. One is, where I worked on my dissertation research in my first monograph, I'm no longer allowed into that cathedral archive because I basically exposed the Jewish pedigree of its bishops during the 15th century. And that is not a story that cathedral wants to tell. And so, as I've been explained to me, is the Jewish history of this city has been done and we're finished with it. So the corollary then is that, I do see myself creating a thematic collection of documents, of archival documents from multiple cathedrals, and placing those into a safe digital repository at my university, kind of using the laws of the United States that state that those are public domain documents, as well as, prior permissions granted to me by archivists who said, when there was a different archivist who said, you can have these photographs for distribution. So I feel like I'm in a really horrible position because I don't, and this is where I'm asking kind of for advice, which is I want to create a new thematic collection that is available to all researchers so that when leaders don't want to release documents, people can still have access to them. But I'm also cognizant of how that might impact future scholars' ability to enter that archive and actually be able to do their research because of a lack of trust that, someone else came in and, stole our documents. So I just wanted to put that out there as for food for thought of how y'all manage that distinction of respecting rights, but also wanting to make information available.
Does anybody want to come in on that question? I mean, I don't have Krista, go for it.
Yeah, one of the things that really stood out to me about the first keynote for this conference about the Hill manuscript sort of digital collections was that they allowed people to view these collections, but only for a limited amount of time. And one of the goals of that was to basically communicate to the public that these are archival documents that belong to individuals or belong to institutions, that these are very, very precious objects, and also to give a sense of security to the individuals and to the collections who held the documents, that they still had some degree of ownership over those, and whether or not it's ethical for individuals or for collections to start claiming ownership over material that was produced 1,000 years ago is a whole other question. But the idea was basically communicating that these are real documents that exist in individuals' collections, and that they should be taken seriously. So I don't know, I don't know if that's a solution, but that was sort of the solution that they came up with, and I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if it's I don't know if it solves things, but I thought it was an interesting strategy, at least.
Does anybody else want to come in? Pavlina?
Yes, I just thought of another chilling example of restricting access to archives, because both in Moscow and St. Petersburg, we have pretty huge amounts of manuscripts taken from Germany after the World War II. And some of them are well studied in the meanwhile, but maybe only in the last decade. And a huge chunk of manuscripts from Leipzig is still kept somewhere, like almost, like I imagine it as a dungeon in the Russian State Library. And it's very badly cataloged. Like you can basically, like you can only get a signature and like a Gebetsbuch, like a prayer book. And you can hardly get to it, even if you speak Russian and if you manage to get to the reading room, because you ask the employee there, like, can I get this manuscript? And it's like, we don't have any manuscripts. What are you talking about? And only after a very lengthy and aggressive discussion, you can get to her boss and talk to the boss. And the boss is like, oh, the German manuscripts. Maybe you can come tomorrow and we will give you those books. And of course you can make no photos and so on. And this has been a huge political issue, because the German side says that, like, okay, we can digitize the manuscripts, but only if you give them back to us. So this physical ownership is very important, and this political issue is very important. And as a result, no one can pretty much get access to the book, to the manuscripts. So yeah, I don't have quite a, yeah, this is just a message. Sometimes we just cannot do anything about it on the level of academia.
Thank you for that example. I think, you know, this really speaks to the power of the archive, the power inherent in its creation, the power around ownership of the archive, and I guess also how much simpler that is with a physical collection. You know, if the only copy, you know, that unique manuscript is in that dungeon in the Russian State Library, those documents are in that cathedral archive, they're controlled, they're safe, you can limit access to individuals. Once those materials are digitized, they're open, they are available. Elaine?
Can I just give a quick example of an ethical issue that I came across, talking about representation again, but picking up on the points that have already been made, and what you're saying now, Suze, about the digital archive. In the Oriental collection of the British Library, a lot of which, as we know, was acquired dubiously, there's been funding for large swathes of manuscripts, Islamic and Ethiopian, to be digitized. And the British Library has very little information about the actual objects themselves. So there's an Ethiopian Gates manuscript. It's got hardly any information about the text or the manuscript itself, but it has got a quite like a 5 or 6 line paragraph about these materials are very special to their communities. Please observe all of their kinds of sets of ethics when you use this material. And I think that's quite good of the British Library to do that, but I don't actually know what it means. I don't know. So obviously I'm going to go and find out, right, by reading up on this stuff. But so it's almost like a cold call to treat Ethiopian religious manuscripts with in the respectful and informed way that the producers and current users would have us use them, but without telling us what that is. And so where is there like a dispersal or a disbursement of ethical responsibility there? So again, it's like making the object legible. How do we use these things? And where does the responsibility lie? End of sentence. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, for me as a curator, like, does that responsibility lie with the institution that owns the material to enable? Is it the institution's responsibility to make that material legible, to give that information, or is it a shared, dispersed responsibility? that we all have to engage with. Ben?
Picking up on that, Suzanne, I just wanted to raise the question, to what degree of mediation should institutions play a role? If we think about a digitization first workflow, where under-cataloged materials are made accessible in some way by sharing images and inviting commentary and scholarship to take place on those, we as institutions then learn from the scholarship and can sort of develop a feedback loop to make scholarly information about these objects more available where they might not have been otherwise. And I bring this up because Professor Traharn and I have gone back and forth a few times on who should be providing the navigation through digitized materials, and if there is some other, the institution, the scholar, a technical team that is responsible for it, or is this a shared endeavor that we're all in together and we can contribute the bits that we can contribute to make it for everybody. Just bringing that up there.
Michelle?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to kind of reflect a little further on this iterative process that Ben brought up and the question of authority, because I feel there's a tension between the technology of dispersal and collaboration. There's all these affordances and possibilities, and yet we still work with a culture where many people expect authority and authoritativeness from the institutions. And so I feel that that really comes around to this, what was coming up in the prior session about making more explicit and integrated into projects and interfaces what has happened behind the scenes, so people know what is the authority and the sources. Obviously, as I, in my talk, I was going through that with one example with the Parker Library, but there are a lot of other examples where inherited data is having a huge impact on what we can find and what we can't find, but the modalities of how the inherited data has been processed and presented are not very clear, and so it's hard to know what you're looking at. And so this question that a lot of people have been bringing up about paradata, I know Suzanne has talked about that, and Emma Stanford, when she was at the Bodleian, talked about it a lot. And I think it's the kind of thing where on one level it's kind of just documentation, but it's another kind of data that can, I think, when more front-loaded and visible, helps to mediate between the static expectations many of us have for the staticness of the archive as an authoritative repository, and the reality, particularly of digital archives, but not only of digital archives, of their fluidity and their instability and their constant change. So, in my talk, I was trying to take two very different examples: a single manuscript that had never been cataloged, and a single manuscript that had been cataloged many times, and to think about the experimental space, so that when I look at my work and what I'm doing with the Dartmouth Brute, on one hand, it is an archive that I'm creating. The blog has been up for 5 years, and there's a lot of documentation there of what different team members have thought and some objects that we've produced. But it's more of an experimental space that tries to expose the process of how we've made things and why we did or didn't make certain things. And that in and of itself is a research output. And so I think to the degree that we can have more normalization of process as research output, that can help with a lot of projects, especially digital ones that are only going to have certain lifespans, and that's a reality. But it doesn't mean that just because they don't last forever, that we can't really have some good traces of them and some good thinking around them as we again think about what we're doing now, how that's affecting the future, because those effects are quite profound. But we can very quickly lose the ability to reconstruct what happened.
And I think I know this, Michelle and I have had conversations trying to reconstruct things that happened in the Parker Library 10 years ago when I worked there, that are just held in my memory, and which is imperfect in itself, and so that you can understand processes that have happened to your manuscript. And so much of what we do as curators is not documented. I think that is a challenge. I think Natasha, your paper was addressing some of this, your presentation. You talked about the importance of data management in projects, and sustainability, and thinking about the afterlife of the project, and how do you want to pick up on that point?
Yes, thank you very much, Suzanne. Yes, and I've been thank you to the discussants. It's been a very interesting discussion so far. And as I've been thinking of archive, of the archive and archiving, I started my mind started zooming in on the kind of more sinister meaning of archiving in IT terms, and kind of digital humanities, but more IT. This is the kind of the ultimate worst possibly thing that can happen to a digital project, the minimal archiving, when it's just getting dumped somewhere. And maybe it can be recovered, maybe it can't. It doesn't, if it doesn't have any more funding, if there's no one responsible for it. So the IT people who are looking after it may eventually take the very hard decision to just get rid of it. And then it will be a lot of work with no guaranteed outcomes to recover it. But that's also, interestingly, the word that is being used is archiving, minimal archiving. So there is some sort of trace that something was there before, but it's very difficult to recover it. And indeed, I think it's there seems to be a big difference between big institutional archives and library collections that are being digitized, or being digitized as a complement to the real, to the physical collections, and smaller projects that have a lifespan and that will eventually come to an end of its funding period, or eventually come to the end of the research period. And obviously people are starting to think more and more about what is going to happen to the work that went into those projects. And one of the options that I discussed in my paper, and I think is becoming more and more accepted, is to deposit the data somewhere else. It's probably in many places, is as many places as possible, so that not just the PI is responsible for holding those files, but there is a recognized place with a digital with a permanent identifier that where this data can be found. And another aspect of this, and I think it ties in a little bit with what Michelle was saying, is that a lot of the work that goes into creating a project is or creating a sort of archive of a certain type of material. If it is well documented, it can then help others and to build their own projects or to build their own archives and avoid some of the mistakes that they were made. But I think we should always keep in mind this kind of slightly sinister but possibly unavoidable meaning of the archive, and always bear in mind the worst case scenario, which is probably just part of life anyway. Thank you.
I think that's a really good point. I know in record keeping institutions, they have their current records, their semi-current, and then their archived records. And by definition, those are the ones that are no longer used, no longer in regular use. And so they go to the archive, is the kind of traditional format of records. And in a digital context, the same thing applies. We cannot assume that, and you know, digital is in many ways even less permanent. I think we're all kind of learning that. Anyone who did any digital projects more than about 3 years ago is anxious or has to accept loss, degradation, errors, and yeah, or yeah, the IT person comes along and says, we're going to archive your project, and will only exist in some kind of very minimal form. You know, are we going to, in the future archive, have to bring those projects out of their sort of digital stasis and reconstruct them to you know, to bring that material back? Is the future archive going to look very much like the present archive? Just wanted to bring up one of those questions from that discussion, which one I circulated the panelists earlier, and this thinking about, as Michelle said, this kind of paradata and the material, so the decisions that we make in creating an archive or a collection, how much do users of our archives, of our projects, need to know about the process of creation, about how it's constructed, and how can we convey that information to them? How can we let them know? Is it about training? Is it about writing README files that nobody reads? Is it about getting people to understand how search works? What could we or should we be doing to help users to understand the parameters of our projects and our archives? Go, Paul. You're on mute, sir.
Sorry, no, just to fiddle around with my machine there. I mean, one of the things at the National Archives, this is National Archives UK, so it's not relating to the project we talked about, or it is tangentially, but we found, particularly in the last decade, that many of the younger academic, early career researchers who are coming to the archive on whatever project they're talking about, whether it be medieval, early modern, or visual collections or whatever, are not coming equipped with the information they need to understand, as you say, why the archive is there, what it's created, just how it's structured. So one of the things we did was develop a postgraduate archival skills training program called PAST, neatly. And we kind of, at the moment, of course, we're trying to work out whether we can do it virtually or not. But the idea is that sort of a 3-step program where students register and they can attend a kind of an introduction, which gets them a sort of a guided tour, some contextual information about the archive broadly drawn. And then there's kind of what we call skills and methodology 2-day workshop where you go much more into detail. We talk much more about, provenance, archival history. Some of the questions we're talking about here, like archival silences, where you can go to find the voices you're not finding. And then in theory, there would be a 3rd stage, which is much more topic focused on whether it be legal records or military records, whatever that might be, modern military records. So, I mean, in terms of big national institution, it does kind of depend on the user groups, because obviously lots of users are literally just information hungry. They just want to know, in our case, where their great-grandfather fought in the First World War, whatever that might be, and a lot of that information is presented for them. It's now been commercialized, of course, which has brought another level of interpretation in, because the commercial what's the word, repackagers want to have their own content. They've got their own people reinterpreting. They want to sell their product in a way that we can't or won't do. But of course, we are bound by 150 years of previous archival management, archival research by my predecessors, who in many cases did work with academics and did work with the user communities of their times. we're now finding increasingly that we do need to reach out to various user groups to find out what they want from us, how we can facilitate that, and where, in many cases, some of the gaps in our knowledge and our collections are that they can potentially help fill. So it's just a long observation, sorry.
Does that resonate with people, this need to have some kind of specialist training to understand the construction of an archive, how to search, what an archive contains, how it's created? Did people, those of you who work with archives, did you get that training? Did you work it out for yourselves? Roger?
Yeah, just to pitch in here, I mean, I think this is one of the big challenges, I think, for medievalists and medievalists in training, is that certainly at the University of Texas at Austin, which is, we're a pretty large graduate program where I started, you know, there really is no training whatsoever to experience the archive. And it's just go and archive, which is kind of funny. And so beyond like the advice that I received, which was, you know, just embrace the terror. And 50 archives later, I still experience that terror like everybody else. The first day that you think that you're a fraud, and that you don't know what you're doing, because you don't. And even working, you know, in a place that's really well documented, like the Vatican Secret Archives, it was funny for the first like 4 hours I was working there. So I think clearly there does need to be some type of like, my hat's off to y'all for providing that type of training, if nothing else, to start to create like some guardrails to say, this is what you should expect. This is what you should not expect. This is how you can prepare before you walk in. Otherwise, you actually may be denied entry into the archive.
Paul?
Just to come back on that, sometimes it can be a bit of a double-edged sword, in that we get email inquiries or in-person inquiries from, let's imagine, MA and early career PhD or PhD students or early career researchers who may be looking to the archives for new information. And to some degree, you have to help them because they clearly don't understand where they need to go, what they're looking for, and how they can navigate their own path. On the other hand, of course, you're then inadvertently directing them in ways that perhaps you want. So it's not completely satisfactory. But on another hand, it does enable us to widen the scope of research into our collection, particularly into some of the hidden corners. And I know, for example, at the moment, we've got an awful lot of engagement from early career researchers with some of our late medieval and early modern legal records, particularly some of the equity courts, because at the National Archives and probably lots of other archives, legal records are some of the most difficult for people to get into because they're just such a mass of stuff. And it's all sort of just a different sort of process material that people find difficult. But the more that people are able to dig, the more they're finding. So, and that's just, another observation.
Thank you, Paul. That's really helpful. I think one of the challenges and opportunities around the digital is that, you know, we do have the opportunity to open that up to a wider audience, to open up the archive to a wider audience. I mean, the challenge is, you know, Paul, you have people come to the National Archives to do a workshop. You can work with them quite intensively with the physical material in front of them. There's a much wider group of people wanting to engage with material. Digital gives us the opportunity to put that in front of them, whether that's just through projects and sites or whether it's mediated through things like MOOCs. And it's a real, you know, this is one aspect of the future archive, I guess, is of the kind of the digital is opening up to the wider audience. I think in terms of MOOCs and thinking about access to collections. Elaine, Ben, and I, with a colleague, Orietta de Rold, did a MOOC on medieval manuscripts, several iterations of a MOOC called Digging Deeper, which was excellent, was really good fun. People really engaged with the manuscripts. We had them learning paleography, learning about conservation, learning about manuscript structures and how they're created. And one of the highlights for me was I invited everybody, thousands of people on the MOOC. I invited them, if you're in Cambridge, drop me a line, come and see the manuscripts in the flesh, which was a slightly rash thing to do. I had people write to me from Australia saying, I'm going to be in Cambridge in 6 months' time, can I come? And I said yes. And everything that they'd done in a digital realm really helped prepare them to see the manuscript in the flesh. And honestly, their reactions to it it's some of the best, the best kind of public engagement I've done was that combination of the digital and the physical. And I think, for me, that's really important, that we don't lose sight of the value of the physical and engagement with the physical. Anybody want to come in on that? Or if you're in Cambridge, come see some manuscripts. Michelle?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of emphasize and underscore this power of the amateur learning process. I'm always telling my students that experts are just people who used to be amateurs who put in a lot of time. And, one of the things about digital archives is you can't really break them. What you sort of have to learn how to do is hack them. I think in Lisa's keynote, when she was describing how at the very end, how she was finding fragments and sort of really hacking her way through the metadata, looking for things she thought were there. I think there are many ways in which that kind of practice has to be experimental, and it is relatively individualistic. And you only start to understand how the infrastructure works and how it's shaping your results when you really just play with it. We've had some discussions earlier about people talking about their formative moment of finding their first manuscript. I remember the first time I clicked on the browser thing that showed me HTML, and I was like, wow, I can kind of understand what that is. But I didn't ever get any training, but we don't have to be afraid to encourage people, I think, to sort of hack around in that way and to bring that spirit of exploration. And now I feel pretty confident about a lot of things, but I would never call myself an expert, but I keep analyzing it. And I think as long as I'm analyzing my experience as a researcher, then I do know what I'm talking about. So.
Thank you. That Natasha's just put in the comments a reference to Samuel's paper. Samuel's not able to join us, but his was a great story of Ephraim Wust, the cataloger at the National Library of Israel, who basically just taught himself. And again, I think that individualistic, experimental, trial and error approach, and for 50 years. He ended up, inhabiting and embodying expertise on the collections in that way. Roger, I don't know if you wanted to come in on your experience of MOOCs and that sort of public engagement with a digital archive in a way that's different from the physical.
Sure. I mean, I think I would probably offer two comments. One is the demise of MOOCs, which is, we started in 2014 with as many as like 14,000 students jumping into a MOOC because there wasn't a lot of selection and participating in some kind of transcription of 18th century transcriptions of medieval manuscripts with good success. But now, the engagement has really changed. Lots of folks, there's so many choices, right? So, you can do masterclass to kind of like intrigue yourself. You can and learn how to cook or play the guitar. And in many ways, the public that I work with, I posted this on Discord, but it's a really well-educated older population like me that is, they're museum goers and they're excited to like learn, but they have lots of interest. 100 to 2,000 students in a year. Now, we can do really great things now in terms of embedding not only kind of instructional materials on how to work with paleography specific to the periods and places we're working in. We can build assignments for these general publics where they're building their own alphabets from manuscripts you give them. So it's kind of a collective project. Or also, machine-based exams where they can really test their skills through working through problem sets, but then also examinations. And then what's really, I have to really, my hat's off to my colleagues at the Universidad de Carlos III de Madrid when I was there as a Marie Curie Fellow. They had suggested, if you really want to have a better outcome for your students, because the MOOCs were closing in on us, the walls, because we had fewer students, give the students a collective project and set them to work on maybe 5 or 6 manuscripts that are maybe 2 to 3 pages in length. And that kind of collaborative kind of activity did 2 things. One, it created a lot of camaraderie in a cohort of students who were from Australia, United States, Latin America. And so they had a good personal experience, but also we got really good data out of it. Nice rough transcriptions with maybe about 75% of the work done for us. They're not diplomatic collections yet, but it's a huge advantage. The challenge obviously now though is there's so much competition for interest. So, today we're using Discord, we're using Twitter, we're using Zoom, we have the website. Finding those eyeballs and bringing them to you is becoming increasingly difficult. And I don't know the solution there now of like, how do I find folks that are interested and do this trade with them, which is, if you'll work with us on the paleography and help us out with this, we'll give you some really nice instructional materials, that feel more like a travel show than the lecture that your professor gave you, 30 years ago. So those are just some thoughts. I'm always curious to hear about others' efforts to kind of engage the public, because like all of us, I think in the room, we're all dedicated to these humanistic resources and fear their loss because governments stop funding our efforts, or there just aren't the private donors that are willing to contribute. So if y'all have thoughts and comments about how you've just engaged, even if it's 5 students, what has worked for you, I'd love to hear that.
Does anyone want to come in on public engagement? I don't know, Elizabeth, Lynn, Paul, I don't know if you want to talk about the public engagement elements of your project and how that's going?
Len, do you want to, because you've been with the project slightly longer than I have?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think just to pick up on what Roger was saying there, one thing, and the project is obviously still kind of in its earlier days. One thing that we have gotten back from presenting material and kind of introducing the project to people, and it's largely at this point to Irish audiences, so people with kind of that very vested interest in Irish history, whether that's members of the Irish diaspora, so of course abroad as well as within Ireland itself. We've had so many expressions of interest from individuals saying, how can I help? Is there anything that I can contribute to it? And in one sense it's a question from our end of capacity. We can't necessarily facilitate every single individual who maybe wants to contribute one particular document, have one particular area, but what we I think, and Paul and Elizabeth will be able to talk about this too, what we have been able to do as a project is reach out to various various other groups that members of the public will also engage in. So say local history groups would be one way that you can kind of bring in members of the public, bring in that level of engagement, but without kind of say just taking the mass expressions of interest that are quite hard to filter through when you're organizing a project like this. So that's definitely one aspect of the public engagement that we've found quite useful by basically working with partner institutions and having friends of the project and kind of mediating public interest through that. I don't know if Paul, Elizabeth, you want to maybe say any more on that?
Mostly just to add that one, not the part of the project Lynn and I are working on, but the one other strand, archival discovery, is all about trying to find copies of things that have ended up in strange places. So one of our colleagues at the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland is actively looking for people to say, I have family papers that will let us, you know, reconstruct elements that were in Ireland, would have been in the Public Record Office in Ireland pre-1922, but would have, if they had survived, been transferred to Northern Ireland. So there's a kind of, so it's different areas of the project are engaging slightly differently. I know we've got thoughts about what we might do longer term for bringing public engagement in for the medieval, but at the moment it's mostly focused on archival discovery. I don't know if Paul wants to add more to that.
I mean, not particularly, although I think some of the talks we've heard this week and some of the videos, just thinking particularly of Sarah Fidderman, for example, on the biocode ecology angle, that's such a strong public engagement angle that, you know, for the work she's doing, the kind of stories you can tell that are beyond the text with new technologies. So, and that, you know, that would definitely have that sort of bring the public in and engage them. I mean, on a personal anecdotal note, this is not to do with the Beyond 2022 project, but I was approached 4 or 5 years ago by a local community group in Lincolnshire, which is where I'm from. And it's just literally, they're researching the history of their deserted medieval village. And they had a group of inventories they knew were in Lincolnshire archives, but they had nobody to teach them how to read them. So they put an advert out. I didn't have anything else to do. Obviously thought, well, I'll see what it's like. I'll get in touch with them. And I ended up having 2 full day sort of sessions with them, sort of taking them through basically what documents are, what hands are, all the kind of usual stuff you do for students. By the end of the first afternoon, they were able to read out individual letters, form words. Now they've gone on to transcribe and catalogue the entire sort of group of inventories, sort of late 15th, early 16th century, belonging to this particular lost community. And they've got involved in loads of the local archaeology projects. They have regular site visits. I mean, it was a National Heritage Lottery Fund application, so the UK lottery. It's part of one of their funds. But, you know, I just happened to answer an ad, really. And it developed from there. It's amazing what people can do with a little bit of tuition. And apparently they keep telling me they put me on their paleography pedestal, which, you know, is odd to hear, but it's also great to hear. It is the kind of the power that archives have to change lives in that sense. It's only a small community, it's only, you know, a small village in Lincolnshire, and they are, you know, they are, as you would expect, white, relatively speaking, middle class, affluent and elderly. So, you know, it's not a community that is non-traditional in an archive sense, but they still needed that mediation, that help to get them going. But once they're going, they've done amazing things, which I'm sure Roger has done in much greater number, the kind of the communities you've been engaged.
Does anybody else want to come in on that? Krista?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think one thread that I've heard rather consistently throughout some of the papers that I've been listening to is the importance of listening to the public about the kinds of engagement that the public want and the kinds of engagement that the public need, rather than making assumptions about that. One thing that really stood out in your paper, Ben, was I think it was your paper where you showed the different ways that people were approaching manuscripts on Parker on the web, and how you know, many people were accessing individual manuscript catalog descriptions through Google. And then I think Wikipedia was quite high up on the list. And so, you know, that to me suggests and really highlights the importance of just, you know, listening first to what the public needs in terms of making these collections findable, making these collections accessible, and then responding to those needs afterwards.
Go, Ben.
So thank you, Krista. That was something that kind of brings us back to a question that Elaine asked at the beginning of the session, which is how do we imagine our publics, and how does that drive what it is that we do? Suzanne and I were on the Parker project sort of in the middle days of the project. And I would say that the intended audience had probably already been imagined by the project leadership at that point in time, but we were part of that in terms of thinking about how the work we were doing would apply to a very specific kind of audience. While Parker 1, the subscription version, was up for about 7 years, our imagined audience and the real user audience was very similar, wouldn't you say, Suzanne? People were coming to Parker on the web through institutional library portals for the most part, where there were subscriptions. As soon as we made that open source, the audience broadened tremendously. And I think all of our assumptions about who was using Parker, how they were using Parker, and what kind of control we had over mediating access to that project kind of went out the window, and happily so. But it does, I think, reflect on when we're building portals, when we're building projects like this, Krista, as you say, meeting the audience where they are and not baking in too many assumptions up front, which is hard to do when you're in a project planning stage. I'm not going to lie about that. Suze, would you have anything more to add to that, since you're now engaged so deeply in the Cambridge University Digital Library?
I think for me, one of the things listening to the papers today was thinking about interfaces. And I think we very much have an awareness now about a separation between the data and the interface. The data, reusable, remixable, enduring, and the interface as something that is temporary, changeable. I mean, conversations with Michelle about the distinction between Parker 1 and Parker 2 you know, help me think about this. And you know, in a way, creating an interface, before you do that, you think about your audience. I was very struck in Samuel's paper. He, you know, is in the early stages of thinking about what the digital version of the Islamic manuscript catalog is going to look like. And he said, you know, he talked about multiple pathways in, trying to give users multiple pathways into the archive. And I think we're all aware of that. Multiple users, multiple pathways, good thing. And he talked about the importance of design, information architecture, and storytelling as modes into the archive. And I just wondered whether anybody had any thoughts about, you know, in projects they've created, design, information architecture, and storytelling as those modes. I also see that in the Beyond 2022 project, that you're engaging on all those levels. I mean, the visuals in your film for what the archive, you know, is really engaging and really tells a story. Does anybody want to pick up on that in terms of interfaces?
This is really my favorite topic. And because interface is really epistemology, right? It structures the way that you know the material, the data. And as we separate data and interface, and we know that the interface will be temporary, that doesn't make it meaningless. And so one of the things I worry about, or I think is potential, is that as it becomes more routine to understand the interface is temporary, that we then don't think about what it's doing quite as much, because we know it's not going to last. So I think its effects are maybe fleeting, but they're quite profound for however long they go. And I think the data, this comes back around to the paradata and the explanations around how a project has thought about design and why decisions were made, and articulating those. Because, you know, any data can be good data if the expectations of the users are matched with what the data is actually designed to do. And any data can be bad data if there's a mismatch. And so I think a lot about interface and the way that it guides. And that there's a lot of analysis to do about the way that guiding shapes how we can ask questions of the data, even though, again, structurally in the computational design, yes, they're separated, but from a book historian point of view, you know, form and content are obviously co-producing meaning. So the separation of data and interface isn't a separation of meaning. So.
Thank you. Natasha, then Ben.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just a quick comment about this separation between the data and the interface. And one of the things that has always struck me on the projects that I've worked on is the fact that very often we kind of sit around the table and say, what if the user is interested in this? What if the user wants to know this? And if we don't look at the manuscript again, or at another piece of information, we don't encode it, or we forget about it, no one's going to ever access it. But sometimes some of these things are in the source files, but they never make it into the end interface. But a lot of work has gone into encoding, let's say, the size of every initial. So it's always also the kind of time issue and focus issue, and sometimes it takes a long time to understand what is important or what can potentially be important. But those things are still in the data, but they never make it to the final product. So it's just a quick comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, yes, the number of, you know, was it explicates we coded for Parker on the Web, and I don't think anyone has ever done a search for an explicate. I mean,
no, the analytics show that was used maybe once or twice, and we suspect it was by Parker librarians. I wanted to weigh in on Michelle's and Suzanne's comments, though, particularly around separation of data from interface, because Michelle, you're absolutely right. The consumer of these sites doesn't see the separation. For them, it's an integrated, meaningful interaction. And some of that comes back to the fact that we're still in the early years of thinking of digital objects as portable digital objects. So the International Image Interoperability Framework makes it possible for any user to take an object out of a user interface context and reframe it, to tell different stories with it, to build new interfaces for it. And I don't think that that's something that we've really come to grips with in terms of ownership as users. So if Michelle, for instance, wanted to take a sampling of manuscripts and build her own interface to tell a different sort of narrative story about them, that's possible for material that is currently interoperable. And I think it opens up some very interesting questions for who owns the quote unquote archive in the future. If institutional responsibility is about serving up these portable digital objects. And community responsibility is about telling the stories and building the interfaces and inviting a multitude of audiences in, basically having many voices communicate through these objects to many audiences. We haven't come to grips with that yet. We're still looking at the creators of a user interface as some other who maybe gets it right or doesn't get it right. And I really am interested in seeing in the next 5 to 10 years how different storytelling approaches with portable digital objects can completely open up our understanding of what ownership means around these items.
Does anybody want to come in on this point around multiple voices, around community and ownership of stories? Okay. Another element I am interested in, slightly related to this, is around translation and transformation. So as things are incorporated into the archive, they are transformed, and you know that they have a different context. I'm thinking about Krista, the material in your immaterial archive, those digital representations of manuscripts that no longer exist have a different meaning. They've been transformed. I'm thinking also about translation in terms of accessibility. Samuel's catalogue of Islamic manuscripts. So Wust's catalogue is written in Arabic. The new digital version is going to be mostly in English to make it accessible. All these transformations and translations that change meaning, and does anybody want to come in on examples or thoughts about? Elaine?
I just want to say one thing about that. First of all, to all of the people who've given their papers this week whose native language is not English, thank you so very much as an English speaker for doing that. How ridiculous, on the other hand, that added pressure is put on our scholars. And there is there's a very significant debate on Twitter this week about working on texts in original languages, about being global in our work and understanding issues of representation, equality and diversity, and at the same time an insistence that we need to be able to access these materials through their original form, which puts actually an impossible pressure on individual scholars, and then a concomitant demand for collaboration when collaboration is not the thing that gets anybody jobs or respect in their institutions. So in terms of this is in terms of translation, Suze, and transformation of materials, the domination of English as the medium through which we have to, it's another colonial colonizing, it's another colonizing, the way in which that pressure is being put on scholars internationally to use this as the language of access, when in fact one of the real problems is that so much of the world's cultural inventory is not written in English and does not get equal time. So it's just a point.
No, absolutely. I think that was something for me about listening to Samuel's paper and thinking, you know, the specialists in Islamic manuscripts globally are going to have to read a catalogue of manuscripts in Arabic and Persian, and the catalogues in English, and in the library in Israel. And maybe there are political motives, maybe it's felt to be a more neutral approach, but I do think you're right that it is problematic, this sense that the domination of English. And I don't know whether people feel that pressure. Those of you whose native language is not English, whether you have any perspectives on accessibility of materials, accessibility of scholarship. Does anybody want to? And whether, artificial intelligence, whether solutions, machine translation solutions, are in any way useful in the future archive in making material more accessible.
I'll say just a couple words about that. I'm a native speaker of English. I've been living in the Arab world for 20 years, however, and I would say that actually I think one of the most interesting and kind of problematic questions right now about accessibility is not necessarily language, but I think there's a big accessibility question around infrastructure. And I've written a little bit about this, and the possibility of being on the same page with English dominant or English-like environments where infrastructure is to be honest, just is the gatekeeper, right? So I mean, language is a question there, and what I mean by infrastructure is not just bandwidth, right? Or availability of computers. I mean, one can go into lots of different questions, but particularly when it comes to digital archives, the capacity of having your institution deliver IIIF images, for example, right? So that the rest of the world can look at it, or look at them, or simply being able to keep up with the first world Joneses, right? It's a big issue.
Thank you, David, for that perspective. And I think it does seem that the digital shift has really enhanced the global dominance of English, and I do think it is something. I mean, it's a wider question than the archive, but it is something we are going to have to deal with. Just checking of all the questions. I think we have covered most of the questions that I put to the panelists in advance. There's just a couple. And as I say, this comes from my perspective as a curator of materials. I wondered whether you see any tensions between scholars and archivists on the needs and priorities of scholars and archivists, and whether you've encountered that, whether you think it's a real thing. Any of you scholars or curators want to weigh in? Otherwise, I'll tell scholarless stories about archivists I've known. Go, Ben.
I was just going to say, I'd like to hear the scurrilous stories.
Paul?
Sorry, I'd like to hear the scurrilous stories too, but I've probably got some of my own, which I'm not going to tell you either. But I mean, we find sometimes, because obviously I guess I might straddle the two, sort of the professional and the research community, because obviously, although I mean, my job has a research element too. We are supposed to bid for funding, and I'm co-investigator on 2 projects, for example. We find there are, I don't know how you describe them, academics who don't really understand what it takes from us to deliver something for them. It's kind of, there's no real connection between their idea and the practical delivery of it at our end. And that's becoming an increasing problem within the digital world, because people see all these great, you know, great projects out there, this great information out there. And I think people expect more from us than we can actually deliver at face value without a proper collaboration, a proper dialogue. I mean, again, these are anonymously, but there's been a recent, you know, large funding call, and we've had 2 separate inquiries from academics who literally wanted digitalization quotes on a mass of material for which we have no membrane count information because it's just not been catalogued that way yet, within a month. It's not going to happen. For just as a for instance, I mean, there's a problem. And again, that does again behove us to be more communicative again with the scholarly community. It's obviously a 2-way street. So I'm not trying to lay the blame anywhere particularly. We're equally culpable.
Yeah,
we're not reaching out in the right way to researchers as well.
I think there is something about managing expectations and communicating. I think I know of some curators who, not in my own institution, I hurry to say, but there are some curators who look at their collections, they have a mass of uncatalogued material, a backlog, and all they would really like is some money to get it catalogued, maybe get it digitized, and scholars come in to do something with a small subset of material that is already well known or already catalogued, or they come in with something very conceptual and I don't know, something. There are some curators who are just like, just give me the money to catalogue, to digitize, to get the stuff out there. I don't know. What would you say to those archivists, librarians?
Suze, can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, if archivists say, look, our priority is just to get this stuff catalogued and digitized. Quit with all your fancy scholarly in and your fancy conceptual stuff. Just give us the money to digitize and catalogue the stuff and get it out there. Krista?
Yeah, if I may, one thing that really struck me in both Elaine's keynote presentation and also Lisa's keynote presentation today was that both of them, unless I misunderstood something, were really saying that can actually be a good strategy in some cases, is to just digitize the material where there are not the resources to catalog everything in a lot of detail. Then it can actually be a very good strategy to just digitize the material, get it up there, and once it's on the web, then once it becomes findable, more researchers can start working on it, and the catalog data and the more detailed research on that material can come later. So that I thought was really interesting, and hopefully I didn't misunderstand that, but my sense, at least from Lisa's presentation, was that especially in the case of these fragments, sometimes the most practical solution is just digitizing them and encouraging researchers to look at them and identify what they are.
Can I just respond to that, Suze?
Go.
Oh, was Elizabeth, did you want to say something?
Just that there's an issue of scale here, isn't there, between big repositories like the National Archives with big teams which can build big projects. And I've done a lot of personal research in very small archives with 1 or 2 people, and they're even just getting someone in to digitize maybe a huge ask in terms of ability to think about it. So maybe you also need to be thinking about this as a spectrum of possibilities depending on scale and resources and the kinds of collections we're dealing with. Anyway, something to think about, certainly.
So I think that's a really important point. Ben and I have worked with the Stanford team at Salisbury Cathedral Library and Archives, which has the most incredible collection of probably 20,000, if not more, documents and high status manuscripts in situ since its foundation in 1220. And so none of it is digitized apart from one register book, which was done by an amateur. And I think, Suze, you've just digitized the Stanford, the Salisbury Cathedral Library manuscript 150, which is the Salisbury Psalter, which I work on and depend on my own photographs in order to work on. So to Krista's point and to Lisa Fagan-Davis's point, you know, one might argue that it's best to you can't work on it if you can't get to it, and we can't bloody get to it when the world is as it is. And if you can't get to it, then kind of in one sense, one could argue, non-archivally, what's the point of it being there? Archivally, of course, there's always a point. Ben and I have had long conversations about this. The sort of snobby scholar says, you know, well, we must have the interpretative framework. You can't just let this stuff loose on the masses. The much more rational and archival sense is you make everything accessible. My point in the thing that you've just referred to, Krista, was as a result of talking to Ben about a specific example at the Vatican Library, which has absolutely, I think I talked about it actually, it's got absolutely no information about it at all. And I'm like, well, you know, what's blah, blah, blah. And he's like, well, somebody will know what it is and somebody can say what it is. But and Ben's just messaged something, the virtuous circle of information. Ben, where are you? Over to you.
Sure, just that. You know, I also asked Suzanne to say a little bit more about the boundaries between what we call archivists, librarians, and scholars, because everybody on this panel is wearing probably at least two of those hats, if not all three. And we just need to, well, I say need to, one thing to consider would be how we can share information more freely about our primary source objects in a way that we can gather this information together, reincorporate it, and build a discoverability around those objects, rather than thinking that there's a responsibility for one group among those that Suzanne articulated. And it opens up some interesting possibilities through the digital world, though I do take DJ Risley's comment very seriously, in that we're talking about a very small portion of the world that's currently engaged in the type of interoperability that we're talking about, and thinking about how we can set up minimal standards that encourage engagement all across the globe to open this stuff up, instead of thinking about the high-cost digitization projects that we've done in some Western European and North American institutions, is, I think, key to making something like this happen globally. So I'll back out at this point.
Thank you. Michelle, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I wanted to connect this idea of kind of just good enough images that I think Mike Toth brought up in the chat from the earlier session, versus the very, you know, pristine, high quality, super high res, as an analog for good enough rough translation versus highly polished, time-intensive literary translation, or the way we think of accurate translation as being, you know, a gold standard. And it's really in that shift, I think, for good enough, especially around information-based texts, like a catalog, that there's a lot of potential to expand with machine translation, the languages used in interfaces and in any born digital kind of text, if we accept good enough, right? It's not perfect. It's not, there's going to be some issues with it, but there's a lot that's going to come through, and that benefit is going to outweigh access by so many more people being able to get something out of the material in many languages. You know, there's a lot of machine translation happening. If you just look at like TEDx talks, all, you know, transcriptions in 30 languages, those aren't things that are being done, you know, by individual careful translators. And I've been thinking about this in relation to literary scholars, and particularly Ardis Butterfield in English, who developed this idea of rough translation for thinking about 14th and 15th century poetry, and that we can have a performance of language that is, you know, playful, semi-expert, but rough, good enough for some purposes, but not for all purposes. And I think that's something, language, for both languages and images, that can be very useful for, again, being very specific about what kind of question a certain document or archive can answer. As long as we're clear about the match, it's okay if it's not all, you know, perfect.
I think this good enough paradigm also transcription applies to transcription and coding. Is there a kind of minimal viable coding that we've talked about, minimal viable description for manuscripts, and transcription, you know, working with tools like Transcribus, where they could, you know, if we're getting 95% accuracy, is that good enough in many cases for the things? It depends on the questions you want to ask and the things you want to do, but it may well be for a lot of purposes. Does anybody else want to say anything about that? Krista?
Yeah, if I may go back to Ben's presentation again, Ben brought up this idea of micro-publications as one way of sort of dealing with the bulk of information that's needed for cataloging manuscripts. And, you know, it would be sort of, this is very idealistic, but wouldn't it be nice if there was some sort of system for micro-publications about individual manuscripts, so that each time one of us made a small discovery about that manuscript that, you know, would not result in a 30-page article, but is still interesting and still valuable, we could generate a micro-publication and then have some sort of system of you know, open peer review for those micro-publications, so that they start off as being good enough, you know, and might not be, you know, peer-reviewed scholarship or something like that, and might contain some errors. But then we could have some sort of open form of peer review in which other people working on the same manuscript could check it over, and, you know, upvote it or, approve it in some way. And, you know, we could sort of generate information starting from good enough to becoming quite scholarly, and you know, having more people's eyes on it, not just you know, academics, and not just archivists, and not just academic archivists, but members of the broader community and people who are looking at the manuscript for their own purposes as well.
David, do you want to come in on that?
I would love to. Thank you. So thank you for saying that, Krista. I really appreciate this idea of something which is good enough, that is not necessarily to the standards that we would have for, say, the publication of a monograph or a critical edition or something like that. But one of the flip sides of the digital, which is interesting, right, is we usually talk about the digital as something which necessarily leads to loss. Right? But one of the things that the digital can actually do is it can actually help us work in frameworks of analysis that allow for fuzziness and allow for a certain amount of error. And so working in domains like statistics, et cetera, that you can actually, you can come to a point where 95% is actually an amazing percentage, right? You know, I mean, we were talking about 5% error rate of characters in our particular subset of the Bible automatic transcriptions. And what was really interesting about that is that I got really different reactions on Twitter, like, well, that's not good at all. And then other people were like, well, that's amazing, you know, and but when you're working in that space of digital analysis, having less than perfect is actually where the rest of the world is with digital, right? And so it provides really interesting windows of opportunity for interdisciplinary conversations with that digital ethos, right? Where other people in genetics and biophysics, you know, whatever, are also dealing with similar problems. Thank you.
Does anyone want to respond? Elaine?
No, I'm not going to respond to that. I'm going to move it on. So if someone wants to respond, I should shut up.
Go for it.
It actually sort of follows on, and this idea of being good enough. And this is a consequence of a conversation that I had with Andrew Prescott at the weekend, where he showed me, it's actually at the National Archives, showed me a kind of a photograph of a cluster of manuscripts that are all kind of bunched together and very, very difficult to unravel. And he's really sure that they're very significant and that there are thousands and thousands and thousands more of those, right? So many discoveries to be made. And someone's just commenting on, so Michael Sargent's just commenting that if it's not Chaucer, nobody's interested. And I really hope, you know, he's saying that sarcastically, and I suppose. And so I really hope that we sort of move on from that idea of what constitutes important. I'm really quite fond of the mundane myself, and there's plenty of that around. And Andrew and I were talking about this. I think what many scholars, and I suspect this might be a difference kind of professionally, and I'd be really interested to hear if that's the case, but what many scholars in arts and humanities really don't seem to understand still is how provisional our scholarship is, and how, as new things come to light all over the place, from people's collection, you know, community archives, personal collections, from fragments that we're now paying so much attention to, from all of this material that is yet to be digitized, from those wonderful presentations on the papyri and the Ein-Gedi scrolls, from Krista's work that she's doing, which I'm so excited to see where that goes, and so on. Every time we make a statement and get it put in a journal and peer reviewed and blah, 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 publish our books, weighty tomes that we cart around, it's so provisional. It's so contingent on the huge amounts of information that are coming into the public domain now, on new readings, on opening up scholarship, on a much more representative and global scale. And that provisionality is really understood, and in fact was just articulated right then by the previous speaker, is really well understood in the science model, that you move things forward, that yours is not the final word. And arts and humanities scholars and students, I think, simply don't get that yet. And when we understand that it's provisional, that opens the door for collaboration, for less than perfect, for an understanding that you can say something and be wrong and be okay with that, in a way that just to date, and particularly with the RAF in the UK and the equivalent in Australia, simply hasn't been allowed to be an acceptable part of the way we go about our job. It also makes our job humane, which it frankly is often not at all. So provisional, and I think it was Andrew and I don't know which one of us said that word first, but that is the key.
I think that's a really, really useful point. I was thinking, when Krista was talking about this, this vision of the collaborative future where people review each other's work in that space and upvote and that kind of thing, and thinking, and yeah, what is your university going to say when you put in a promotion file that's full of upticks and transcription, scrappy bits of transcription that you've done for people? Or the model that we have really doesn't allow for that kind of informal or messy collaboration that really helps to move scholarship along. But yeah, institutionally, it's not recognized. So hopefully, in the future, we will start to assign value to those kinds of things. And I think that understanding of provisionality is freeing. You're right, Elaine. It is humane. It does free us up to just put stuff out there and negotiate with others and make stuff available. I want to try and pull up some questions from the Q&A and the chat and the Twitter and all the things. So wish me luck, because I have about 15 different sources. One question that has flashed up for me is around the fact that there are national initiatives in some areas around national infrastructure to support digitization or to support digital projects. How do people feel about those sorts of national infrastructures for supporting the archive? Either the archive that you're creating or digitization projects. I see it in France, in Germany, in various other places, not so much in the UK. Anybody, any thoughts about national infrastructures? Ben?
It's a model that seems to work in certain parts of the world. I don't see it happening in the United States. As you said, you don't see it happening in the UK. I don't know if Canada is in a better place for this. And certainly there are a number of parts of the world where a national infrastructure is simply unfeasible. So are we talking primarily European Union type national infrastructures or something beyond that? I'd be interested in knowing what the framing of this might be.
Yeah, I can also see some national infrastructure, some settings where this kind of project to, say, curate the national past might have more kind of nationalistic undertones or overtones and might be problematic in some ways. Paul?
So I just wonder whether whether in the UK context, at least, I don't know whether it's changing a wee bit. There is this big new initiative towards a national collection, which I know colleagues in the National Archives are putting proposals towards at the moment. And it's supposed to be supporting research that breaks down the barriers that exist between the UK's outstanding cultural heritage collections, with the aim of opening them up to new research opportunities and encouraging the public to explore them in new ways, is what the blurb says. So, I mean, it might well be that recognition that you've spoken is lacking might now be coming, although it's 18.9 million over 5 years. So, only so much you can do, I guess. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that at this point of Brexit, etc., this initiative towards a national collection has been, this is government funding. This is the British government, approaching the funding of cultural heritage in this way, which I think is interesting.
I might, if I could, just follow up, I suppose, on some of what on that question, because I think it is something that is quite relevant to the Beyond 2022 project. Obviously, this is a project that has funding up until a certain point, but yeah, I think it's probably worth thinking about that. It ties into that question of ownership of archives, and how that links in. Obviously, the archive, the Public Record Office of Ireland, which was destroyed in 1922, it's in a rather different category. It is it is a national project on the one hand, in terms of bringing back that aspect of national history, and so in terms of having an infrastructure there, I don't know, Elizabeth, if you wanted to jump in on this as well. It's something that is that is a way for people to engage in the project as part of that national history and where it fits into that broader location, as something that belongs to the public, but also is very much an international project as well, and is relying on collaboration. So it's national and international can kind of intersect, and having, I think, multiple levels of support.
Yeah, and I think for us on the Beyond 2022 project, one of the things that's most interesting in terms of framing is we're explicitly framed as part of the centenary commemoration, 1922, 2022. So it's a history which in itself is incredibly fraught, and ownership of the records, if they had survived past 1922, would have been interesting to try and break up what went where and who owned what at that moment. So that collaboration, commemoration, national memory, all of these things are actually quite intertwined, and different aspects of them get pulled out at different moments. And then, of course, things with national collections and Brexit, which take on a very different resonance at this moment. It's an interesting problem to try and solve, not least when some of this is being driven by who's funding what and what funding priorities are in different places and different, whether that's national funders or private funders. So that's sort of an added complexity, I think, to that discussion.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think that sense of follow the money and who is funding, why are they funding this particular work, is definitely something we all need to bear in mind when we're looking at projects, in terms of, as we started off at the very beginning, talking about choices that are made and mediation and decisions. I think the decisions that funders make about the shape of the funding call, what kinds of things they're prepared to fund, is definitely worth us all bearing. Another question, sort of in this national, international arena, Simon has put in the chat, is an Anglo-American digital mirror of an African or Arabic archive decried as colonialism or a measure of stability in a very unstable world? Which I think takes us a little bit back towards that sense of ownership and the distinctions between ownership of the digital and ownership of the physical. How do people, colonialism or a measure of stability to have? Anybody have thoughts?
I'll jump in, but bearing in mind that I'm coming very much from international collaboration is good, but also that ownership of the digital surrogate in some senses does have to be tied to ownership of the physical book or object, because often those things are seen as being so tightly interwoven. That my instinct would be that there's no one right answer to that question, that it has to be negotiated case by case and archive by archive. So, for example, if a community says, yes, we would like you to keep these images because this is the best way to preserve them, then that's a discussion and a conversation that needs to happen, whereas other communities might make a very different choice for their own very good reasons. So I don't think we can answer it in blanket terms. I think it's got to be collaboration and discussion and building relationships over time, because Beyond 2022, I joined a month ago, but it's been built on 5-6 years of collaborations from other people that have built it into something where we can start having discussions about where the images go, who's going to use them, what's going to be the possibilities here. And so I think, yeah, I'm saying I'm going to reject that as a binary choice, I think.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Does any, I think I'm coming to the end. Yes, we were just Zoom bombed by Compline, which is your little foretaste of the next Dark Archives activity, which is going to be a lot more musical than this. Does anyone have any additional questions? Is there any of the attendees that want to put some questions in the chat? Because I think we're getting close to winding up. So if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask the panel, then please put them in the chat in the next few minutes. In the meantime, should I give you a hard question to be finishing off with, or should I be nice to you at this point? How about I think I want to pick up on something that Michelle talked about in her paper. Michelle's had to leave, but she talked about oh, there you are, Michelle, thank you. This typology of material, that the known and unavailable, the known and available, unknown, unavailable. I would just like to say, if you could make one discovery in an archive, what would it be? What would be the one thing that would really transform you? I want to know individually, what would be the one thing that you would want to find in an archive, something that you maybe have an inkling is available, something that you know is lost that you would love to find? Does anybody have anything that they know that you know once existed and that they would love to find? Ben, do you want to start?
Those of you who know me know that I ask this of everybody I meet, but the one thing that I want to find is the sale record of the now lost Machaut Rotulus that was last seen at Maggs Brothers in 1928. I know that record is somewhere, and I want to know where the manuscript went to.
Anybody else, their dream item that they would find, the lost work that they know that must be out there somewhere? Lisa's saying more Beauvais missile leaves. Yeah, Lisa, we know, but you find them so regularly that, you know.
I think I'm not interested in loss. I think we've got more than enough to be getting on with. And I think my dream objects are pretty much every manuscript that I come across.
So you're finding something every time you go into a library or archive?
Yeah.
No, that's
small collections, big collections. There is always something to connect you to the human of the past.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's really something that this conference is highlighting. I think we're really seeing, for me, finding those connections with the past across this whole spectrum of material, you know, from Matthew's graffiti through to manuscripts from all manner of times and places. I think that the connection with the past is just so enduring. Yeah, there's some great. Melissa wants the holograph of Dante's Commedia. It's good luck, Melissa. Let's see if anybody out there can find it. But these are the Dark Archives. I think I'm going to wrap things up I just want to say a huge thank you to all our panelists. You've all been brilliant. You've all contributed and you've all helped us to think more deeply about these topics. I guess we should come back in 5, 10, 15 years and see what the future of the archive really looks like and see how right or wrong we were. But thank you so much to everyone for participating, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference, and whether that's Compline later on or whether that's the rest of the presentations. But thank you one and all. Cheers. Bye-bye.